Mouse Castle towered over everything around it. It was quite impressive if Sombra was being honest with himself. The sharp edges and narrow spires gave a sense of commanding authority, and yet somehow the castle never sacrificed the strangely whimsical aesthetic so common to the little village where he's been forced to spend his convalescence. The mouse, her loud pink friend, and the white one were quietly speculating on what could have driven their friend to call an emergency meeting so early in the morning. Sombra gathered, from his inconstant attention to the conversation, that Twilight was not what one would call a morning pony. Pinky's current running theory was that she ran out of coffee in the castle. The others laughed, but Sombra would have placed a higher premium on caffeinating the local ruler properly than filling the castle's coffers. He remembered well the long nights and early mornings spent administrating the Empire's rapid expansions under his rule. Still, Sombra doubted something like that would warrant the gathering of the 6 mayors who potentially had access to one of the most powerful artifacts of antiquity. Another notion occurred to him as they entered the castle that had also occurred to Fluttershy. Had they discovered my reveal? No thoughts had slipped unbidden into Sombra's mind, and even though he couldn't see how it would have happened, he could not dismiss the possibility. I may be walking into a trap. Far too late to back out now, though. Besides, the likelihood is low, and I confess myself curious. These mayors may be my enemies soon, and I cannot deny the value of seeing the inner workings of their council first hoof. As the 4 of them passed onward through the entrance hall and into the inner sanctum, Fluttershy caught Sombra's eye. He could see the worry there, and curiously, he was not sure how to feel about it. Was she worried for what would happen to her should she out him while the guise was still in effect? Did she fear that he would attempt to kill her with the guise in order to prevent them from harnessing their power? Did she fear that he would attempt to kill her with the guise in order to prevent them from harnessing their power? Her expression didn't match those feelings, so Sombra decided. Then what was she worried about? If he didn't know better, it looked like she was worried for him? Absurd. Sombra mentally scoffed. This is the mouse's best chance to end my control over her. The guys won't let her tell my secret directly, but if they guess, or already know, then there'll be little I can do about it. As the final doors was pushed open, Sombra found himself annoyingly reticent to step through it. It was a gamble. Either he gathered valuable intel for his future campaigns, or his future was cut short then and there. No, Sombra decided, there was no reason to hesitate. If they knew, then his leaving would not prevent them from hunting him down. It would only delay the inevitable if this Twilight was truly an alicorn, as the mouse had said. Had he fully recovered, or even halfway perhaps, fleeing would be an option. But he could barely manage a couple of short-range teleportations without exhausting his magical reservoirs. With his hesitation banished, he trotted into the sanctum, just behind Fluttershy. Inside was almost exactly as he pictured, a grand crystal map detailing all of Equestria, most impressively in real time if the moving weather patterns were anything to go by. That was surrounded by 6 equal thrones, each embossed with a different cutie mark. The throne bearing a 6-pointed star surrounded by small sunbursts, and another, almost child-sized throne beside it. Leaning over to Fluttershy, Sombra voiced his question. It seems to me that each of these thrones denote equal status. Is that correct? Oh, yes, I suppose so, Fluttershy answered, a little confused. We're all friends, and neither of us overrule the other when we're making decisions. We have to come to an agreement. That's the rule. Then it's safe to say your authority is essentially the same between each of you? Sombra continued, to which Fluttershy gave a small nod. So what you are saying is that you yourself have authority roughly equivalent to a princess of a sovereign nation. Fluttershy opened her mouth with what looked like a refutation on her tongue before stopping, closing it and furrowing her brow. Sombra had to admit that the look of concentration on her face was unusually but not unappealing. It was almost cute. I suppose that's true, Fluttershy answered carefully. But I also can't make decisions on my own. It has to be the 6 of us, unless there's no other choice. Indeed, Rarity interjected. I'm sorry, dears, but I couldn't help overhearing. To clarify, in a sense, each of us is given equal voice. Yes, we have equal authority. But the truth is, ultimately, only Twilight can pass legislation and edicts under the laws of Equestria. However, when she and the other princesses were laying down the laws that would permit the authority of a fourth princess, Twilight insisted that a law be placed in the books that we other five each be given the opportunity to vote on anything she wanted to pass. Twilight is a dear, and she has learned from her mentor quite well. No ruler is perfect, and Twilight is quite aware of the value of a good naysmith, as it were. That's right, a voice interrupted the group of them. I'm not much good without my friends, after all. A lavender alicorn with a dark purple mane streaked with violet and rose had entered, trailed by two other ponies. The first was Rainbow Dash, and the other, Sombra assumed, Applejack. He vaguely recalled seeing the orange-hatted pony in the Crystal Empire before his revival. Behind them was a smaller figure Sombra had nearly missed. It took some effort to keep the scowl from his face as the little dragon, responsible for his first explosive demise, entered trailing behind Twilight. I didn't realize we had a guest, Twilight continued as she stepped in front of Sombra. Sombra noted that while she hadn't quite come into her alicorn status yet, she still stood a good height over her friends. My name is Twilight Sparkle. This is my number one assistant, Spike. Although I'm afraid you're come at a pretty unfortunate time. Twilight stuck out her hoof, which Sombra curiously shook. She truly was new to her authority, treating him as an equal when, to her eyes, he should be a commoner. Nonetheless, Sombra decided to play the part. Making a small bow, he careful to lower his head beneath hers. Sombra introduced himself. I apologize for my unplanned presence. My name is Cole Amox, and I'm afraid I was with Fluttershy running some necessary errands when we were caught up, and your friends thought it best for me to accompany them rather than to leave me floundering in an unfamiliar town. Oh, I thought you might be new. Twilight smiled graciously. Well, welcome to Ponyville. Wait, you said you were with Fluttershy? Twilight glanced questioningly at the quiet Pegasus standing comfortably by Sombra's side, who smiled demurely and repeated the now familiar story he had been telling. Cole is a scholar here from the Crystal Empire to study the Everfree Forest. I offered him room and board at my cottage so he could do his work in peace and quiet. Sombra watched Twilight's eyes grow wide with delight. A scholar! She almost shouted before turning back to Sombra. You're an Imperial Scholar! Oh gosh, I have so many questions. I would love to get your perspective on local magical innovations. You just have got to tell me what the Imperial College was like in its heyday. Do you have any published papers I could read? With every sentence, Twilight got closer and closer to Sombra until they were practically muzzle to muzzle. Thankfully, a lasso appeared around Twilight's barrel and dragged her back. Sombra had begun to fear for his virtue, or whatever was left of it anyway. Whoa there, Sugar Cube. Applejack listened as she reined in her overeager friend. I'm sure Mr. Amox would love to talk shop with ya. Was under the impression that we're here for something important. Oh, yeah, right. Twilight lost her carefree expression completely, her face taking on a more serious mien that immediately got everyone's attentions. Girls, we have a serious problem. I just heard from Cadence a few hours ago. King Sombra has returned. Sombra felt a shock and chill run down his spine and settle in his gut at her words. And glancing over at Fluttershy, she saw her ears had shot up and her eyes had gone wide. She glanced over at him with stark terror in her gaze. Mastering himself, Sombra gave her a confident smirk and a nod. She visibly calmed, a little of the tension leaving her wings and withers. He wasn't sure why he had comforted her, but it felt better that she wasn't so worried now. Every pony else on the other hoof was not so fortunate. What? Rainbow shouted. Seriously? We blew that guy up! Literally blew him up! Damn shadowy varmin. Applejack scowled as she began rolling up her lasso. Rarity gave a contemptuous snort. That slaving ruffian just does not know when to back out gracefully, does he? I did say it was an emergency, Spike said, his slightly chubby features making his expression look more petulant than anything. Don't worry, we can zap up there, fire the friendship cannon, and boom! Pinky's ascribed humor seemed to diffuse some of the tension. Pinky, I really wish you wouldn't call it the friendship cannon, Twilight said, with a kind of dull frustration in her voice that suggested they had made their request before and fully expected it to be ignored again. Are you sure it's Sombra? Fluttershy piped in finally. I mean, he seemed pretty gone to me back then. Sombra can't help but admire Fluttershy's ability to say something perfectly true and perfectly misleading. He couldn't have done it better himself. Twilight, though, just nodded as she turned to the two of them. Well, Cadence said that a great pillar of shadow and smoke was seen in the northern ice fields last evening, and again in the pre-dawn this morning, only further out by Pegasus Scout. Twilight remarked with a dark look on her face. So unless you can think of another creature that moves around using dark magic in shifting form. Quite a few come to mind, actually, Sombra said before bringing his hoof to his mouth, as if he was ashamed of the sudden interruption. A plan had already formed in his head. Besides, the shadow obviously wasn't him, bowing an abject apology. Sombra lowered his eyes from Twilight. I am terribly sorry, Princess. I spoke out of turn. No, it's okay, Twilight said, a hint of relief seeping into her voice. Please, I want to hear what you have to say. Standing up straighter, Sombra affected a look of embarrassment before continuing. Well, you said the subject traveled in a cloud of shadow, and given that Miss Dash is right, to which the cocky Pegasus gave a smug nod, and Lord Sombra was destroyed quite thoroughly, I think it's a bit rash to leap to the conclusion that he somehow survived. There are plenty of creatures that use shadow to move after all. Concentrating on a point back in Fluttershy's cottage, Sombra found himself quite thankful that he had retrieved this particular book from his stash as he teleported it to his side. The drain was small, but annoyingly noticeable. Flipping it open, Sombra continued speaking. For instance, it could be an Umbrum Shambler or any other of the number of the Photovores. The minor and lesser variants of the Shadow Golems, constructed by Lord Sombra during the Second Shadow War, also have inconsistent forms that would match the description you gave. It could even be a Sundog, as they travel in a shadow-like fog, although close inspection and a magical scanning spell would be needed to reveal its form and the telltale halos around its head. Glancing back up, he gave the surprise mares a perfectly unassuming smile. And those are just the ones I can think of off the top of my head. I'm sure there are a number of more exotic creatures I haven't considered. After all, the Arctic North is a habitat for umbrum and penumbral beast, given its extremely limited exposure to sunlight, and I would hate for my homeland to devolve into a panic because the princess jumped to conclusions, justified though her fears may be. That actually makes a lot of sense, Twilight said, her voice betraying a mixture of surprise, confusion, and relief. I should send a reply to Cadence letting her know that there are other possibilities before she makes a rash announcement or declares a state of emergency. Excellent. That'll buy me plenty of time, Sombra mused as he gave a small nod. Although I do wonder what is currently haunting the low pink nuisance sitting on my throne. Maybe I opened one of my vaults while I was in my frenzy. That would be delightful. Well, I'm glad my expertise could set your mind at ease, Your Grace. Sombra gave another small bow as Twilight blushed furiously. Please, call me Twilight. She waved her hoof frantically. I know alicorns are supposed to be semi-divine or something, but be honest, I still just look like a regular pony. That's hardly proper, darling, Rarity remarked from Sombra's side. Among us, I understand, but Cole is right to treat you with the respect due to royalty. That is something you will have to get used to after all. Celestia doesn't seem to care, Rainbow quipped, floating a few feet above the ground. Princess Celestia has ruled for over 1,000 years, Rarity retorted. Her authority is unquestioned. Twilight has been a princess for less than a year. She has to establish herself. As the two argued, Sombra watched Twilight out of the corner of his eye inch closer and closer to him until she could crane her neck just slightly to get a look at the book he was holding. It was endearing in a sense. Twilight was certainly not what Sombra would have envisioned in the leader of the motley group. In a sense, he felt a kinship with her. Actually, Twilight seemed to share his innate love of knowledge and pursuit thereof. Is that? Twilight's voice was low with awe. Is that a copy of the Bistro Malefica? Sombra's ears folded back as Twilight near screamed at the last two words. Yes it is. Twilight looked as though she was barely restraining herself from tearing the book from his grip. Incredible! There are scholars who think the book doesn't even really exist. It's only been manufactured or referenced in a half-dozen pre-Nightmare texts. There's never been any real proof of the book ever actually existing, and now it's inches in front of me! Glancing over at Fluttershy, she saw her stifling laughter. Twilight was looking at the book with the kind of glazed expression one would normally reserve for a soulmate or lover. Sombra was vaguely worried that if he took his eyes off it, he might come back to find the book and Twilight in a compromising position, and no amount of potential blackmail would bleach the particular mental image from his mind. "Twi, I think you're scaring the poor fella." Applejack reined Twilight back yet again before turning to Sombra. "Sorry about that, partner. Twilight's a mite excitable over dusty old books, but that ain't no excuse for bad manners. The name's Applejack. Put her there." The solidly built earth pony mare stuck out her hoof with a kind of forthcoming directness that Sombra found oddly nostalgic of his childhood. His family and neighbors had been much the same. "Cole Amox," he said, taking her hoof and shaking. "A pleasure to meet you, Miss Apple." "Aw, shucks, just Applejack is fine," she answered with a good-natured chuckle. "Gotta say, you're a pretty big fella for a professor." Applejack's gaze took a more critical tone. Sombra couldn't say he was surprised. "Applejack?" Fluttershy started, but Sombra held up a hoof and giving Fluttershy a small nod. "It's quite all right," Sombra answered before turning back to Applejack. "That's because I don't hold professorship with Imperial College. I'm a research scholar. I study plants and animals with magical natures and write papers on them. I don't think I'm suited to be tied down to a lecture hall. Far too, as you say, stuffy. My work requires me to travel regularly and suits me well, I think." I guess that makes sense," Applejack answered. She still wore a thin smile, but Sombra could feel the edge on it. "Too bad y'all weren't around during the first Crystal Empire fiasco. Could've used a smart fellow like yourself." "Well, I'm afraid my mind wasn't quite my own at the time," Sombra replied with a wry smile. "I'm sure you recall." Applejack gave a perfectionary nod. "Yeah, I suppose the whole memory thing would have put a damper on it. Where were you doing the Crystal Games, out of curiosity?" Sombra could tell that the other mares were beginning to get uncomfortable. He just had kept stringing Applejack along enough to satisfy her, preferably before she punched a hole in the one problematic area of his story, namely what happened between his first return and his true revival. "I had already left the Empire by that point, I believe," Sombra answered, affecting a tone of pensive concentration. "I took a sojourn over into the icy north to see what had changed amongst the flora and fauna of my homeland before setting out to Greater Equestria." Applejack worked an eyebrow. "Out in that frozen wasteland? Alone?" A rainbow blur interposed itself between Sombra and Applejack, cutting Sombra off before he could respond. "Hey, AJ, what's with the third degree? Cole's cool, so what's up?" "I'm just getting to know the fella," Applejack replied hastily. "If he's going to be living with Fluttershy especially. Land's sakes, Rainbow Dash, I thought you'd be a mite more concerned." "Hey, I talked to the guy." Rainbow gestured vaguely towards Sombra. "He seemed solid. Being loyal only means trusting people, and I trust Fluttershy, okay?" Applejack responded with a stiff nod. All right, I reckon that's a fair call." Turning to Sombra, she tipped her hat. "Sorry about that, partner, but my protective instinct's rearing up. Hope I don't put you off too much. We're all sort of protective of Fluttershy." "I'll bear that in mind," Sombra answered before turning away. He felt another headache coming on, and by the throb near his horn, it was not going to be a small one. Why was his magic taking so long to return? He hadn't expected to be able to manage the feats of power he possessed at his height, but teleporting a 2-pound tome that bore his own personal touch less than 2 miles shouldn't have drained him so badly. As he looked back at the young mares, who apparently jointly ruled the countryside, he wondered if there wasn't something inherently about this area that hindered his magic. He wondered if this was what's causing his headaches as well. "Girls, I'd love to stay, but I have a lot of work to catch up on," Fluttershy injected, drawing Sombra's gaze. She glanced at him with concern in her eyes. "Plus Cole needs to finish setting up the guest room he's renting out. Didn't you say you had some work you needed to finish today?" She directed the last question at him, and he gave a small, thankful smile. "My fortune in finding this mare may very well have used up whatever luck has kept me going this long." "Yes, I do," Sombra answered quickly. "It was lovely meeting all of you, but I do have responsibilities. I'm sure you understand, Your Grace." "Oh, yes, I do." Twilight said, clearly a little unhappy. But I would love to speak with you when you're more settled. Consider my castle doors open to you at any time. If you need reference material, I propose one of the best libraries outside the Royal Archives. I deeply appreciate the offer, Your Grace, Sombra replied, magnanimously etching a deep bow, as he raised his head and turned to leave with Fluttershy. Sombra quickly scanned the room. Rainbow was in conversation with Pinkie, who waved goodbye, a sentiment he returned. He had a very material reason to stay in the Pink Coot's good graces if he wanted more of those scones. Rarity winked and offered a quick "have a safe walk," as she turned back to Twilight, who had begun dictating a letter to Spike, probably to the usurper. Applejack caught his eye, though, as she was still looking at him curiously despite her apology. Her eyes slightly narrowed. I suppose I shouldn't be surprised that the element of honesty regards me with suspicion, though she did an excellent job of hiding it so. Sombra thought as he turned his back to the small group. It was far too risky to try any subtle magic to sway her mind this close to an alicorn. Besides, the mouse's description of her friends marked that one the least susceptible to my powers. Best not try it, till I'm stronger. She won't act with all of her friends poised against her. 5 out of 6 isn't a bad number after all. Miss Apple likely won't make a move unless she's sure, and so long as I stick to the plan, by the time she's sure, I'll be long gone. As they left the castle, Sombra took a deep breath of the clean morning air before turning on the road to head back to the college with Fluttershy by his side. You have my thanks for the timely extraction, Mouse. Sombra spoke coolly, his reserved and imperious demeanor returning with the lack of witnesses. Fluttershy's ears flicked slightly, and she gave a small bow. Of course, Your Majesty. I can get you more painkillers when we get back to the college. Good, Sombra replied, wincing slightly as his head twinged. In addition, you will keep me apprised to this shadow in the Crystal Empire. I want to know what is threatening my former kingdom. Fluttershy nodded. As you say, Your Majesty. If it is one of mine, then all is well, Sombra thought darkly. If not... Sombra thought back to the damaged Gate of Horn. There is no shortage of dangers that could threaten a Dreamwalker, but if one had escaped to the material realm, then he would have far more problems on his hooves. No king rises without making enemies. Not all enemies can be slain. The walk back to the college was uneventful, aside from Sombra's occasional twitch and grunts of pain. Fluttershy found herself getting worried. The headache last night was small and easily understood. Today was different, though. Sombra had barely used any magic beyond basic telekinesis, and had done anything more strenuous than a leisurely walk. Despite that, the master's headache seemed many times worse than it had last night. Oh, there I go again, calling him master, Fluttershy thought to herself as she did her chores. It wasn't quite noon, but she was already behind due to the emergency meeting Twilight had called. You need to stop thinking him like that. He's not your master, he's an evil sorcerer. That's not quite fair, is it? Evil is a strong word, after all. Tyrant had been evil. Chrysalis had been thoroughly evil. Even Nightmare Moon had been evil after a fashion, though she was crazy at the time, so maybe that was a gray area. But Discord had never been evil, just bored and omnipotent. Fluttershy considered that. She would have once labeled Sombra with the others, but now she's getting to know him. She realized that wasn't as true as she had thought. Sombra, for all his merciless nature and frankly disturbing ability to lie, still cleaved to a code of honor, and willingly held himself up to his principles of behavior. Fluttershy could still recall her surprise from yesterday. Was it really only yesterday, when Sombra had declared that he would not stoop to breaking her mind or forcing her to do something uncouth solely based on his honor? The tyrant she had learned about didn't fit that mold very well. The mind enslavement part fit him to a T, of course, but to be honest, she was surprised at how little he had actually used it. It helps that you're so accommodating, her mind treacherously whispered back to her. Well, what was she supposed to do? Fight him and suffer? Then he wouldn't trust her, and if he didn't trust her at least a little, then she would never be able to reform him. That, and she would just get hurt while he would still be recovering. No, Whatever the case, this was still the best avenue to handle the situation. Fluttershy wasn't going to fool herself, though. He was dangerously charming, and Rarity, ever the romantic, had picked up on that. Suggesting that he was smitten with her, though, was probably a misread on the unicorn's part, though. No, not probably, most certainly. It was a little past noon when Fluttershy trotted into her cottage. She took a moment to wash her face and hooves before preparing lunch. She didn't know if Sombra would be awake, but it would be rude not to at least be ready. He had gone to lie down after they had gotten home, and she hadn't heard from him since, though it had only been a few hours. Fixing a few simple sandwiches and a glass of lemonade, Fluttershy balanced the food on a small tray and carried it back to his room. Silently, she pushed open the door to enter and found Sombra laying on his back on her mattress. The room was dark despite the noon sun, with the curtains pulled tightly closed. There was only a few beams of light providing some dim illumination. Doing her best not to wake him, Fluttershy moved to the small end table near him and slid the tray down onto it soundlessly. "You are not that quiet, Mouse," came Sombra's rumbling voice. Fluttershy squeaked in surprise as Sombra rolled over and up to look at her. His eyes were back to their normal shade, that strange and hypnotic rolling green indigo, and black had spoke of his strange and terrible power. Thankfully, his body had returned to normal. Gone was Cole Amok's mortal dimensions, replaced by the Master's titanic frame and wickedly curved horn. "Thankfully?" Hermione whispered. "What exactly are you thankful for?" "I'm sorry if I woke you, Your Majesty." Fluttershy bowed, keeping her thoughts off her face. "I brought you some lunch. Are you feeling any better?" "Some, yes." Sombra responded before levitating one of the sandwiches to him and examining it. For a moment, Fluttershy was afraid she had done something wrong. But then he said, "Aren't you hungry too, Mouse?" The question caught Fluttershy off guard. "Oh, yes, I suppose I am. I was just going to make myself something after you finished, though." "I see," he answered. "And if I told you that I wish you to eat here and now, with me?" Fluttershy opened her mouth to respond that wouldn't be proper, but her mind caught up before she spoke. Rethinking things, she said instead, I would like that, Your Majesty, if you don't mind, of course." This was important. Fluttershy could feel it. He had asked her to stay, and she wanted to know why. At his nod, she moved a little closer to the mattress and retrieved one of the sandwiches for herself and began eating quietly. The silence was deafening as they ate in a strained sort of quiet. Fluttershy considered it to be one of the most awkward lunch dates she had ever been on. Sombra seemed unwilling to break the ice further, but Fluttershy wasn't willing to lose this opportunity. There was no telling if he would let propriety slip this much again. "Was the Crystal Empire really once as small as Ponyville, Your Majesty?" Her voice cut neatly through the silence and sounded too loud to her ears, but then again, everything sounded a bit too loud to her. Sombra was silent for several moments, apparently finding great interest in the remaining crust of his second sandwich before answering. "It was," he said, his voice unusually soft. "It was very small indeed, in fact, although as a foal I thought it quite grand, I suppose. I could see the palace from the roof of my family's little home. I recall how much I treasured the rare nights when the skies were clear and the moon was bright. On those nights the Crystal Palace seemed to shine and dance in the moonlight." "That sounds wonderful," Fluttershy said softly. She remembered wondering what Sombra had been like before he was a king. Perhaps her imagination had been far off. "Most of all, I remember the cold, though," Sombra continued, his voice still soft, but Fluttershy could hear a hint of strain in it. "Or sorrow? My family was very poor. Every pony was, unless you were a Cadenza." He spat the last name with much bile that Fluttershy recalled. His features softened as he saw, though. "I apologize. My memories of the royal family are cruel ones. There was very little food, and even less warmth in those days. We all slept huddled together, my mother and father, along with my 2 brothers and 4 sisters, out of necessity. In winter, it was not uncommon for the weak and sickly, the very young or the very old, to not wake up at all." Fluttershy felt tears on her face. She could hear the bitterness in his voice, and it cut at her heart. "Why?" she croaked out. Why didn't the royal family help? There was naught that they could do, Sombra answered darkly. They were alicorns in name and body only, it seemed. A little stronger than the average Pegasus, Earth Pony Unicorn, but they were not gods. They could not conjure food, so we starved. They could not provide warmth that was not snuffed out in moments by the chill winds, so we froze. Not that many of them cared to try anyway. Fluttershy cringed at the resurging bitterness in his voice. For once, she couldn't find it herself to blame him. What about the heart? Sombra scoffed quietly. The crystal heart was not even a pipe dream, Mouse. It was not crafted until I was a stallion grown. Oh, was all Fluttershy could say. What did you do then? The only thing I could do, Sombra answered. I endured, as I always have endured, as I shall continue to endure through any indignity, through any torture, and through any hardship. A king always endures. It is what gives us the right to rule. I don't think any pony has the right to rule, Fluttershy said softly before cringing at the expression of another jolt of pain like earlier this morning. When it didn't come, she looked up and saw him waiting and watching her expectantly. Working up her courage, she continued, I think some ponies do have a responsibility, though. And what do you imagine is the difference? Sombra rumbled, his sandwich floating almost forgotten beside him. Fluttershy thought about his question for several moments before coming to an answer, though she knew it would probably displease him. I think that if you believe that you are a responsibility for some pony, then it's a burden, but you take it on because you want them to be better, to live better lives. But if you believe it's a right, then all that matters is that you think you're better. They don't matter in all the case, Your Majesty. How astute, Sombra muttered. I suppose that has more merit to your argument. That surprised Fluttershy. Really? Sombra nodded. In respect to most leaders, I would say you're quite right. But do not forget that I am better, Mouse. There is not a single living crystal pony who does not owe their lives to me. Not that any pony bothered to remember that in the end. For a moment, Fluttershy felt confused, conflicted even. On the surface, it sounded as though Sombra had just indulged in the same self-aggrandizement the story described to him. The Sombra that Fluttershy knew, though, was nothing like that. He didn't even sound angry over the matter. Instead, it was more like a bitterness over an old wound. How do they owe you their lives? Fluttershy asked, inching a little closer. To her surprise, Sombra scooted over, and, not willing to turn down his willingness to open up, she joined him on the mattress. Will you tell me, Your Majesty? Sombra's expression turned distant and contemplative again. It was one that Fluttershy had learned to like, actually. An aspect of the Dark King she didn't really feel bad about liking either, and the expression restored some of his equanimity. It was a Sombra that Fluttershy was trying to bring to the surface. In her opinion, it made him look more handsome, too, giving a resting, almost alone aspect that she wasn't the least bit ashamed to say she found attractive. His cruelty stole most of that from him. I never did tell you what my mark meant, Sombra said in response. Glancing back, Fluttershy looked at the strange rune on his flank. It's a amalgamation of 3 symbols, you see. Sparking his horn, he created 3 distinct shapes made of shimmering green light floating in front of the 2 of them. Fluttershy examined each one in turn. On the first was a horned circle and a small cross. The second in the middle was an empty triangle and a large cross, while the third and final mark on the end was a simple bisected circle. Sombra pointed his hoof to the leftmost symbol. This is the ancient alchemic symbol for the spirit, of which Martin is called the mind. The next, he pointed to the middle symbol, which means soul, while the final symbol is for the body. Each symbol wavered for a moment, for moving and blending together. When they solidified again, they were one symbol, Sombra's cutie mark. It means that I am in harmony with myself, Sombra explained. My mind, body, and soul are in unity. Many scholars neglect their body, while the strong often neglect their minds. Both tend to neglect the need of their souls. Even as a foal, I bent the whole of my being toward one goal. I had uncommon drive, I suppose, and like a foal, my goal was equally absurd. I wanted to end the endless winter with my own hoofs, something I proudly and loudly declared to my family. Fluttershy couldn't help but laugh a little at the mental image of a tiny, full-sized Sombra hopping onto a chair and proclaiming that he would end winter and save the Empire. Sombra huffed, and Fluttershy leaned back against him, resting her head on the crook of his neck. "I'm sorry, Your Majesty. I didn't mean to laugh, but that's really adorable." A part of her was surprised at her bravery, but this position felt almost natural. The strength inside of his body, combined with his warmth, was comfortable. "That may be so," Sombra grumbled. "I never lost that notion, though, even at the very end, when things were at their very worst." Not thinking, Fluttershy snuggled in closer, looking up at the king, who was too lost in memories to be troubled by her boldness. "What happened?" "It was the winter that came in my 30th year. It was the worst we had ever seen,